Let me be direct with you from the outset, because that is what this moment demands. What is unfolding between Iran and the United States right now is not a diplomatic process. It is not a negotiation in any meaningful sense of that word. What we are witnessing is a carefully constructed theater of pressure, deception, and narrative manipulation. The very architecture that Washington has perfected over decades of dealing with nations that refuse to submit to its imperial dictates. And if you believe, even for a moment, that Donald Trump's posturing represents a genuine desire for peace, then you have not been paying close enough attention. Stay with me, because what I am about to lay out will fundamentally alter how you understand everything you have been told about Iran, about this so-called ceasefire, and about America's true intentions in this region. I speak to you from Tehran, and I want you to understand what that means today. Not as an abstraction, not as a geopolitical coordinate on some analyst's map in Washington or London, but as a living city of millions of human beings who have endured and continue to endure an assault that the Western media has sanitized beyond recognition. Life in Tehran on the surface carries the texture of normally. You drive through the streets and you see a city functioning, shops open, people moving, the rhythms of daily existence persisting with the quiet defiance that has come to define the Iranian character. But beneath that surface, there is an awareness that few in the Western world are permitted to understand, because understanding it would require acknowledging truths that are deeply inconvenient for the governments and media institutions that shape Western public opinion. Schools remain online, universities continue remotely, and this is not, as some Western commentators have lazily suggested, evidence of dysfunction or collapse. It is evidence of prudence. It is the rational response of a government that has watched firsthand how the United States and the Israeli regime conduct their military operations without warning, without regard for civilian life, and with targeting logic that, as we now know with devastating certainty, included children. The parents of those children were officers in the Iranian military, and the belief here, held not by fringe voices, but by serious, thoughtful people across Iranian society, is that those children were targeted deliberately to send a message to their fathers. Think about what that means. Think about what kind of government, what kind of military establishment operates with that calculus. And then ask yourself why the phrase Mr. Nice Guy was used by the President of the United States to describe the opening phase of this assault. But what comes next is even more revealing. When Trump posted his now infamous statement, Iran can't get their act together, they don't know how to sign a non-nuclear deal, they better get smart soon, accompanied by an image of himself brandishing an automatic weapon with a caption, "No more Mr. Nice Guy." He was not speaking to Iran. He was not speaking to diplomats or negotiators. He was constructing a domestic narrative for an American audience that has been systematically deprived of accurate information about what is actually happening in this region. The man who positioned himself as Mr. Nice Guy presided over strikes that on their very first day killed 168 children in their school. His own Secretary of Defense, a man not typically known for restraint or moral courage, refused to endorse Trump's claim that Iran was responsible. He said they were investigating because even within the machinery of American imperial power, there are limits to the shamelessness that career professionals are willing to display publicly. Trump had no such limits. He knew, his military apparatus knew, every target in those opening strikes had been vetted for months, possibly longer than a year. Day one operations do not leave room for error or ambiguity. Those targets were chosen. Those children were chosen. This is the foundation upon which all subsequent negotiations have been built. And it is essential that you understand this foundation clearly before we examine what has happened in the week since. Because without this context, the American narrative, repeated faithfully and without interrogation by the Western press, appears almost coherent. With this context, it collapses entirely. And if you think that's surprising, the next part is even more significant. Let us address the question that Western media has spent enormous energy obfuscating the Iranian nuclear program. Trump's statements about a non-nuclear deal are constructed to imply something that the evidence simply does not support. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is subject to IAEA oversight that for years was more intrusive and comprehensive than that applied to any other nuclear program in the world. The IAEA has never produced credible evidence that Iran's nuclear program is anything other than civilian and peaceful in its orientation. The United States' own intelligence community concluded after 2003 that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapon. This was not a fringe assessment. It was the formal position of the American intelligence establishment. Joe Cirignoni, in his resignation letter, reiterated that Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons. Tulsi Gabbard stated under oath before the United States Senate that Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons. These are not Iranian sources. These are American officials speaking within American institutional frameworks, reaching the same conclusion. So when Trump frames this conflict around the nuclear issue, what is he actually doing? He is doing what American administrations have done for decades, constructing a pretext, a malleable, perpetually renewable pretext that can be deployed whenever Washington decides it needs justification for economic strangulation, military aggression, or political destabilization. The nuclear framing is not about nuclear weapons. It never has been. It is about leverage. It is about finding a pressure point that resonates with a Western audience already primed by years of media conditioning to associate Iran with existential threat. And in this, the American political establishment and its media apparatus have been extraordinarily effective, not because the evidence supports their claims, but because they control the platforms through which most people in the Western world receive their information. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes. The question of negotiations, of what actually happened in Islamabad, of what the foreign minister's trip to Oman and Moscow truly signified, requires us to cut through a remarkable volume of deliberate confusion. Let me be precise about the sequence of events, because precision is the first casualty in Washington's information wars. Iran's foreign minister had a planned itinerary: Pakistan, then Oman, then Moscow. These were scheduled, purposeful, diplomatic engagements. There were no plans, none, zero, for the foreign minister to meet with American negotiators during this trip. And yet, with extraordinary brazenness, the White House began announcing through its press operation and through the Western media outlets that faithfully amplify its claims that American negotiators were traveling to Pakistan specifically to hold talks with the Iranians. Iranian officials repeatedly and clearly stated that no such talks were planned. The Western media, with equal clarity, ignored those statements and continued to report the White House's version of events. This is not a minor discrepancy. This is not a misunderstanding born of poor communication. This is a deliberate pattern, one that serves a specific strategic purpose. By creating the impression of ongoing negotiations, Washington achieves several objectives. Simultaneously, it presents itself to its domestic audience as the reasonable party, the one extending the hand of dialogue while portraying Iran as intriguing or chaotic. It generates confusion internationally, making it harder for third parties to accurately assess who is acting in good faith and who is not. And it provides cover for continued violations of the existing ceasefire agreement. Because if negotiations are ongoing, the pressure to actually implement previously agreed commitments is conveniently diffused, but it only gets worse from here. The ceasefire agreement that was reached, and this point cannot be emphasized strongly enough, included explicit commitments that the United States has systematically refused to honor. The agreement was supposed to produce a regional ceasefire. That meant Lebanon. It meant Gaza. and it meant the lifting of the siege on Iranian ports. What happened instead? Netanyahu, within days, announced that Lebanon was not included in the ceasefire. Trump echoed that position. The Pakistani mediator, not an Iranian official, not a source with any conceivable bias toward Tehran, explicitly confirmed that Lebanon was indeed included. After 10 days of pressure, Netanyahu was compelled to accept the ceasefire's application to Lebanon. Iran then signaled its willingness to allow ships from the 5 Gulf states that had assisted the United States, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia, to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. This was a concrete, meaningful gesture of compliance and good faith. Trump's response was to announce that the naval blockade of Iranian ports would continue, not as a negotiating position, not as a temporary measure pending further talks, as policy, a direct, unambiguous violation of the ceasefire agreement that his own administration had just signed. And so the ships did not move, not because Iran was being obstinate, not because Iran was unable to get its act together, as Trump's social media post so crudely put it, but because the other side of the agreement had been violated, first by Netanyahu on Lebanon, then by Trump on the ports, before Iran had any reasonable basis for moving forward. I want to be very clear about what the blockade of Iranian ports actually represents, because Western media has been almost entirely silent on its implications. A closer examination of the sequence of events reveals how quickly factual clarity becomes contested in moments of high geopolitical tension. Iran's foreign minister reportedly followed a prearranged diplomatic itinerary that included visits to Pakistan, Oman, and later Moscow. These engagements were framed as part of ongoing regional diplomacy rather than a crisis negotiation with the United States. According to Iranian officials, there was no scheduled plan for direct talks with American negotiators during this particular journey. Despite this, statements attributed to U.S. officials and echoed in parts of Western media suggested that American negotiators were traveling to the region specifically to engage Iranian representatives. Iranian authorities publicly denied that such meetings had been arranged, but these denials were not consistently emphasized in Western coverage. The result was a divergence in narratives. One side describing structured, pre-planned diplomacy, and the other projecting the expectation of imminent bilateral engagement. From an analytical standpoint, this gap illustrates how diplomatic signaling can be shaped as much by narrative construction as by formal agreements. When competing versions of events circulate simultaneously, perception itself becomes a strategic domain. Even the suggestion of negotiations, whether confirmed or denied, can influence domestic audiences, international observers, and the broader interpretive frame through which subsequent actions are judged. This interpretive conflict extends into the question of ceasefire arrangements and their scope. Various accounts have described differing understandings of what was included in a broader de-escalation framework, particularly regarding regional theaters such as Lebanon, Gaza, and maritime access routes. Some parties interpreted the arrangement as regionally comprehensive, while others asserted more limited geographic applicability. These inconsistencies created immediate friction over implementation, with each side accusing the other of deviating from agreed terms. Maritime conditions, particularly in and around the Strait of Hormuz, became a focal point of dispute. Iranian officials have consistently maintained that the waterway remained open to international shipping, while also indicating that access conditions could vary depending on political alignment and context. Independent reporting from multiple maritime analysts has generally supported the view that transit continued, though risk premiums and insurance costs fluctuated during periods of heightened tension. At the same time, media narratives diverged sharply over whether disruptions represented full closure selective restriction, or standard wartime risk conditions. The deeper dispute, however, lies in interpretation, whether such measures constitute legitimate strategic leverage, reciprocal response, or forms of coercive pressure with broader humanitarian consequences. Critics of restrictive maritime or economic measures argue that disruptions to civilian trade, especially goods such as food and medicine, risk blurring the line between military pressure and civilian harm. Others counter that such measures are part of a broader sanctions architecture intended to constrain state capabilities rather than directly target populations. Within this environment, diplomatic engagements such as reported negotiations in regional capitals have taken on heightened significance. Accounts of discussions involving Iranian and American representatives in venues such as Islamabad have been interpreted in sharply different ways. One perspective emphasizes the technical preparedness and centralized authority of the Iranian delegation, describing a structured decision-making process with clearly designated negotiators empowered by formal institutional channels. The contrasting interpretation of the American side often highlights a more fragmented or multi-layered chain of authority in which negotiators may be constrained by parallel consultations with domestic political leadership and allied regional stakeholders. Reports and commentary have suggested that external consultations sometimes influence negotiation dynamics, although the extent and nature of such influence remain disputed and difficult to independently verify. In this context, the breakdown or suspension of talks is often followed by contradictory public messaging, with claims of both imminent agreement and simultaneous escalation circulating within short timeframes. This pattern contributes to uncertainty, making it difficult for external observers to determine whether diplomatic processes are advancing, stalling, or being redefined in real time. Alongside formal diplomacy, narratives about internal political stability in Iran have also become a contested informational front. Western commentary has at times emphasized internal divisions or institutional strain, while Iranian officials and sympathetic analysts describe a centralized system of strategic coordination operating through the Supreme National Security Council. This body is often portrayed as integrating executive, military, and supervisory functions into a unified decision-making structure for matters of national security and foreign policy. The divergence between these portrayals reflects a broader pattern in geopolitical analysis. External observers frequently interpret opaque systems through familiar frameworks of fragmentation or cohesion, depending on broader strategic assumptions. Whether such interpretations reflect internal realities or analytical projection remains a matter of ongoing debate among regional specialists. Security-related discourse further complicates this environment, particularly when discussions turn to targeted individuals, negotiators, or scientific personnel. Public commentary in various international media environments has at times included highly provocative rhetoric regarding legitimate targets in conflict scenarios. Such statements, whether rhetorical or substantive, tend to intensify mistrust and further erode already fragile diplomatic confidence. At the same time, Iran's external relationships, particularly with Russia and other non-Western powers, have expanded in both scope and strategic depth. These developments are often interpreted as part of a broader realignment in international relations, driven not solely by ideological affinity, but also by practical responses to sanctions, security concerns, and shifting global economic networks. Military cooperation, trade diversification, and diplomatic coordination have all reportedly increased in parallel with heightened external pressure. This dynamic has produced what some analysts describe as an unintended strategic consequence. Rather than isolating targeted states, sustained pressure campaigns may contribute to the formation of alternative alliances and parallel institutional frameworks. Whether this represents a long-term structural shift or a temporary alignment driven by shared constraints remains an open question. On the economic front, Iran continues to face significant internal challenges, including infrastructure damage, industrial disruption,